The reeve in the marten collar said it loud enough for the whole muster to hear. He wraps his feet like a corpse in linen. Someone behind him laughed, a thin sound that carried in cold air off the moor. Women drawing water at the trough looked away. A boy with no shoes repeated the phrase until his mother pulled him back by the ear. Below the road, between two frost-heaved stones the size of a pig pen, a man was doing something that looked like madness. He had taken off his boots, though the ground was white with rime, and he was stuffing them with dry straw. Not a handful, 2 careful handfuls per boot, pressed down with his palm. Then he wrapped each foot in a strip of gray wool, then in a strip of linen, blackened with ash and grease. He did not look up. He tied the linen with twine, pulled the straw-filled boot back on, and stood. November 3rd, 1316, the north road out of Pickering, Yorkshire, where the second failed harvest had left the fields bare as beaten floors, and the king's levy was gathering men for the Scottish march. Thomas Crow knew the road. He had walked it to market since he was 12, carrying barley on his back. He knew the distance to Durham was 5 days if the weather held. What he had not known, what no sergeant shouting at the muster had bothered to mark, was that 5 days in wet leather on frozen ground took feet the way a saw takes green wood. Slowly, then all at once. Thomas was 29 years old and a villain of William de Vesey. He owed 3 shillings and 4 pence for mill toll and a day's boon work each week through winter. His wife Alice was 27 and had not complained once since the barley failed, which worried Thomas more than if she had wept. Quiet Alice meant counting Alice, and counting Alice meant she had already done the figures and found them wanting. Their daughter Mara was 8 and kept the thatch tight with her own hands, patching holes with heather. Their son Peter was 4. He coughed when the air turned damp and asked questions no one could answer. Why did the fire smoke more than it warmed? Why did the Lord's horses eat while they did not? They had in the hut 1 sack of oats, perhaps 14 pounds, a half sack of maslin flour cut with pea meal, a pot of salt, no meat, a cracked pipkin that held water if you set it level, 3 wool blankets, 1 cowhide, a billhook, a thatching knife, a wooden spade, and the chest that held Thomas's father's tools. 2 bone needles, a hank of twine, a lump of tallow wrapped in cloth, a small bag of wood ash from the hearth, and 3 good lengths of linen salvaged from a dead priest's alb. The chest was not cargo. It was the reason Thomas could be taken for a soldier and still hope to come back a man. Without it, he was a field hand with soft feet. With it, he was a thatcher's son who understood how to keep water out and heat in. The Reeves band had come at Michaelmas. All straw from the Demesne fields belonged to the Lord for thatch on the manor barns and bedding for the war horses. Any man found taking straw for his own use would pay a fine of 6 or spend 3 days in the stocks. The band was read in the church porch while the congregation stood in mud. Thomas had listened and said nothing, because saying anything cost more than straw. The sergeant at the muster was named Robert Harding, a man of 40, who had marched to Bannockburn and come back with 2 toes fewer on his left foot. He looked at Thomas's wrapped feet and shook his head. "You will march 5 days to Durham," Harding said. "You will march in what you wear. If your feet rot, you fall out. If you fall out, you are a deserter. If you are a deserter, the reeve takes your hut for the fine." He let the silence hold. Then he said the words Thomas already knew were coming. "Take the straw out. March like the rest." Thomas did not take the straw out. He had watched his father thatch roofs for 20 years. His father, John Crow, had taught him two things about keeping a house warm that Thomas had carried without knowing he was carrying them. First, dry straw traps air, and air that does not move does not carry heat away. Second, wool holds warmth even when damp, and ash draws damp out of cloth and skin. John used to stuff his own boots with straw on winter days when he worked the high roofs, not because straw made heat, because straw kept the heat his foot made from being stolen by cold leather and frozen ground. Thomas looked at the muster. 40 men in boots that were thin at the soles, some in clogs, some with feet bound in rags already wet from the morning frost. He looked at Harding's missing toes. He looked at the reeve's marten collar. Then he bent and tightened the twine on his left boot. "I will march," Thomas said. The first day proved the arithmetic. The road climbed out of Pickering onto the moors. Frost lay in the hollows. The men who marched in bare leather felt the cold climb through the sole within the first mile. By noon, their feet were white at the toes. By evening, they sat by the fire and peeled off boots to find skin blistered where wet leather had rubbed. Thomas's feet stayed dry. The straw inside the boot compressed under his weight and formed a mat 2 fingers thick. The mat held the shape of his sole. Between the straw fibers, air stayed still. His foot warmed that air. The wool wrapped wicked sweat away from his skin. The outer linen, rubbed with tallow and ash, stopped water from the outside soaking in. At the end of 10 miles he took his boots off, and his feet were warm and pink. No blisters, no white spots. Walter Smith, who held the next strip of land to Thomas, watched him unwrap. Walter was 35, a good man with a bad back and the kind of imagination that extended precisely as far as the next furrow. "You will get the rot," Walter said. "Straw holds damp. Damp kills feet." "Dry straw holds air," Thomas said. "Wet straw holds damp. I change the straw each night. I dry the wet straw by the fire. I rub the linen with fresh ash each morning. Ash is for the fields," Walter said. "The reeve said, 'Straw is for the Lord.'" "The reeve is not marching," Thomas said. That night Thomas showed Mara's trick without meaning to. He had brought a spare handful of straw in his scrip, wrapped in a cloth to keep it dry. He laid it by the fire to warm. When he changed his foot wraps, he used the warm straw. The heat from the straw went into his foot for the first few minutes of the march the next morning. It was a small thing. Small things were the difference between a foot that started warm and a foot that started cold. On the second day, it rained. Cold rain that turned the track to mire. Men marched with water over their ankles. Leather soaked through in an hour. Feet macerated and rubbed raw. 3 men fell out before noon. Harding left them at a crofter's hut with a penny each and no promise of return. Thomas stopped at midday, sat on a stone, and took his boots off. The outer linen was wet. The wool beneath was damp. The straw was dry. He wrung the linen, rubbed it with ash from his pouch, and put on fresh wool from his scrip. He kept the same straw because it had stayed dry. He was walking again in 5 minutes. His feet did not blister. By the 3rd day men were watching him, not the reeve, who had stayed in Pickering, but the other villains. They watched him stop, unwrap, change the outer layer, and walk on while they limped. On the 4th night, at the camp before Durham, an old man came to his fire. His name was Edmund, 62 years old, a shepherd who had been pressed into service because he could still walk and the levy needed bodies. He had served in Wales 30 years before and lost half his right foot to frost. He walked with a limp and a staff. "You rap like the Welsh bowman," Edmund said. He did not ask permission. He sat and held his maimed foot to the fire. "I rap like my father," Thomas said. "Your father was a thatcher," Edmund said. He knew about thatch. Thatch is straw that stays dry because air moves under it. Boots are thatch for feet. Edmund showed Thomas his own method. He carried no straw because the reeve's men had searched his bag. He carried dry moss from the high moors and a bag of crushed charcoal. "Moss holds more air than straw," Edmund said. "Charcoal draws water better than ash. But the order is the same: dry material against the ground, wool against the skin, grease and powder on the outside to stop wet getting in." The Welsh called it keeping the foot in a house. You do not heat the house with a big fire. You keep the small fire the foot makes from blowing out. He taught Thomas 3 things that night. First, pack the straw loose, not tight. Tight straw has no air. Loose straw traps air. Second, change the wool every day even if it feels dry. Wool holds damp you cannot feel. Third, never let the outer linen touch skin. Linen soaked with tallow goes hard and cold and cuts. Thomas listened. He had known the first 2 from his father. The third was new. On the 5th day they reached Durham. 40 men had left Pickering. 31 marched in. 9 had fallen out with feet too blistered or frosted to walk. Thomas Crow walked in with feet that were tired and sore but whole. No blisters, no black toes. Harding looked at his boots and said nothing. The levy was dismissed after 3 days because the Scots had not moved and the king had no money to feed idle men. Thomas walked home. He walked 5 days back on the same road in the same wraps, changing straw each night. He arrived at his hut on the eve of St. Martin with feet still his own. Alice was waiting at the door. Peter coughed in her arms. Mara stood behind her with a pot of thin pottage. The hut was cold. The fire smoked but did not warm. Wind came through the wattle walls where the daub had fallen out in summer and never been repaired, because there was no dung and no straw to mix new daub. The reeve's ban meant no straw for peasants. Thomas set his pack down. He took off his boots. He unwrapped his feet. The straw inside was still dry. The wool was damp. The linen was crusted with mud and ash. He laid the straw on the hearth to dry. Peter coughed again, a wet bark that made Alice's face tighten. Mara pulled her blanket closer. The temperature inside the hut was only a little warmer than outside. Thomas looked at the walls. Wattle woven from hazel, daub missing in patches the size of his hand. Wind moved through the gaps and took the heat from the fire before it could reach the sleeping platform. He remembered his father's second lesson. Stone remembers heat. Straw traps air. It was not just for feet. He did not explain this to Alice. Not yet. He measured. He found the thatching knife and cut heather from the moor edge where the reeve's men did not patrol. He cut it at night, 2 bundles carried on his back. He gathered dry bracken from the wood. He took the straw from his boots, the straw he had carried for 10 days, and he did not burn it. He began with the north wall, the coldest. He wove fresh heather into the wattle where the daub was gone, not tight, loose enough to hold air. Behind the heather he packed dry bracken. Over the bracken he laid a layer of straw, the same loose pack he used in his boots. Then he mixed ash from the hearth with a little clay from the yard and water, and daubed a thin coat over the straw. Not thick. Thick daub cracked. Thin daub held the straw in place and stopped wind. Alice watched him. She did not ask what he was doing. She watched his hands and she watched the wall, and after a few minutes she began sorting their bedding into piles. Blankets, hides, clothes. Every pile was a decision about what would go against the new wall and what would stay near the fire. Walter Smith appeared at the door. He had come back from Durham 2 days earlier, limping, with both feet wrapped in rags. "You are thatching the inside," Walter said. "I am wrapping the house like a foot," Thomas said. "That is not a house. That is straw in a wall. Fire will take it. The fire sits on stone. The wall is behind the fire. The straw is sealed with ash clay. It will not burn unless the house burns, and then we have worse problems." Walter shook his head. "The reeve will fine you for the straw. The reeve will fine me for breathing, if he can weigh it," Thomas said. Walter left. He did not offer help. He did not offer condemnation. He walked back to his own cold hut. The work continued. Thomas lined the north wall and the west wall, the two that took the wind off the moor. He left the south wall alone because sun hid it in the afternoon. He packed the gaps around the door with bracken and covered it with a hanging of wool. He built a sleeping platform raised off the dirt floor using stones and boards 18 inches high. Cold air pooled at the floor. Warm air rose. The platform put the children in the warmer band. "Set back!" The reeve's man came on the third day. He saw the fresh straw in the wall and demanded 6pence. Thomas had 4 pence. Alice offered the cowhide. The reeve's man took the hide and 2 pence and left. The hut was warmer, but they had lost their best blanket. Set back. The straw on the west wall got damp from a leak in the thatch. Thomas had to pull it out and replace it with dry heather. He worked in cold rain while Peter coughed inside. Then Edmund the shepherd came. He had walked from his own village after hearing about the wall. His maimed foot was wrapped in moss and charcoal. "You built a boot for your family," Edmund said. He did not ask permission. He tapped the north wall with his staff. The sound was dull, not hollow. Good pack. Air is still. He taught Thomas the 4th thing. Ventilation. A sealed house with a fire will fill with smoke and damp breath. You need a low intake and a high outlet. He showed Thomas how to leave a finger-width gap at the base of the door hanging and a thumb-width hole in the thatch at the peak, covered with a flat stone to keep rain out but let smoke out. Air enters low, feeds the fire, rises with heat, exits high. The house breathes like a man. Thomas cut the holes. The smoke that had hung at head height began to draw upward. The air near the sleeping platform cleared. That night the temperature fell hard. Frost formed inside the unlined huts in the village. In Thomas's hut, the fire burned low, 2 small logs. The walls held. The straw trapped air. The ash clay stopped wind. The raised platform kept the children out of the coldest air. Peter slept without coughing for the first time in weeks. Mara pressed her hand against the north wall in the morning and said it was not cold. Walter came the next morning. His feet were still wrapped in wet rags. His hut was cold. His wife was sick. "Show me," Walter said. Thomas showed him. Not the whole wall. The principle, loose dry material to trap air, a layer to stop wind, a way for smoke to leave. Use heather if you have no straw. Use moss if you have no heather. Use ash to keep it dry. Walter did not thank him. He went home and began pulling heather. The reeve came himself a week later. He wore the marten collar and carried a stick. He looked at the lined walls and said, Thomas had stolen straw. I used heather and bracken and the straw from my own boots, Thomas said. The straw you banned I carried on the King's Road for 10 days. The reeve fined him anyway. 3 pence he did not have. Edmund paid it with a silver penny he had kept from Wales. You are teaching others to disobey, the reeve said. I am teaching others to keep their children alive, Thomas said. The reeve left. He did not take the walls down because he could not prove theft and because other men were watching. Winter deepened. The Great Famine winter of 1316 to 1317 killed many. In Pickering, 3 families left their huts and walked south begging. 2 old men died in their sleep. In Thomas's hut, the family lived. Not well. They ate thin pottage and oats. But they were warm enough that Peter's cough eased. Mara did not get chilblains. Alice did not lose feeling in her fingers. The proof was not dramatic. It was a pot of water left by the fire overnight that did not freeze solid. Outside, water froze to the bottom. Inside, a skin of ice formed, but the center stayed liquid. The walls held heat the way his boots had held heat. In February, the secondary crisis came. A thaw followed by a hard freeze collapsed part of Walter's roof. Snow fell into his hut. His wife and child were inside. Walter ran to Thomas. Thomas and Edmund went. They did not dig down through the snow on the roof. They dug sideways from the door, tunneling under the collapsed thatch, using boards to shore the tunnel roof the way Edmund had shored mine roofs in Wales. They reached the wife and child and pulled them out through the tunnel. The child was cold, but breathing. They brought them to Thomas's hut and laid them on the raised platform against the north wall. The wall was warm from the fire, not hot, warm enough. Walter sat by the fire and looked at the lined walls. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Your father was right." "My father was a thatcher," Thomas said. "He knew straw remembers air." Spring came late. The levy was called again. Thomas was not taken because Harding remembered his feat and said the army needed men who could march. Thomas stayed and repaired walls in the village. He taught the boot wrapping to men who would march. He taught the wall lining to women who would stay. He did not charge. He asked for a handful of ash or a strip of wool in return. By summer, 6 huts in Pickering had north walls lined with heather and bracken and ash clay. None of those families lost a child that winter. Edmund left in May to go back to his sheep. He left Thomas his bag of charcoal and his staff. "You do not need to swing a sword," Edmund said. "You need to keep feet dry. Armies march on feet." Thomas kept the staff by the door. He used it to tap walls and listen for the dull sound that meant the packing was still good. The reeve never lifted the straw ban. He did not need to. Men had learned to use heather and moss and bracken. They had learned that the secret was not the material. The secret was air that does not move. Thomas Crow is not in the manor rolls. He paid his 3 shillings and 4 pence in 1318 after a good oat crop. He lived to 54, which was old for a villain in that time. Mara married a carpenter and lined her own house. Peter became a thatcher and taught his sons to stuff their boots with straw before they climbed roofs in winter. The trick was banned because straw belonged to the Lord. It survived because men understood that a foot is a small house and a house is a large boot. Both stay warm the same way. Not with big fires, with small fires kept from blowing out.